Hey everybody, welcome back. So, it's been kind of a rough week, but I had a conversation with somebody the other day and it kind of gave me an idea for today's video. I wanted to talk about something called apathy. So, apathy is probably something that you've heard of at some point. It's actually not really as uncommon as people think it is, and sometimes it's more situational than it is permanent, because some people are naturally apathetic all the time, and some people it just kind of depends. But basically, apathy is kind of the opposite of what you would expect if you hear somebody who's empathetic or sympathetic. With empathy, you're sensitive to people's needs, to people's feelings, and usually you're a pretty nurturing person. You see somebody sad, you want to cheer them up. You want to know what's going on, what's bothering them. With sympathy, it's pretty similar, but that's kind of more from your own personal experience. Like, if you notice that your friend is experiencing something like depression and you've experienced depression in your life and you know how that feels, you're going to feel like you can relate to them on more of a personal level. So when you want to help them, not only are you being empathetic to their needs, but because it's something you've experienced yourself, you can use like your own personal experience to help that person. Well, when you hear something like apathy, it's the opposite. You tend to have a lack of feelings towards somebody or their situation. And believe it or not, this is something that can actually be very common for people who've experienced a lot of trauma and or stress in their life, because it can be a coping mechanism in some cases. I wouldn't exactly call something like apathy as a productive coping mechanism per se. I would consider it more of a maladaptive coping mechanism, and here's why. With apathy, it tends to work better more in the short term than the long term. If you are experiencing a lot of stress or in your life, or if you've been through a lot of trauma and you're feeling very maxed out, I mean, one person can only handle so much in their life. You know, you can help some people here and there and, take the time to listen to them and everything. But people get burnt out over time. If you have a lot going on and you're really maxed out and then you see more situations arise, it's not always uncommon for somebody to kind of, those feelings of caring and wanting to help people can very quickly go inward. Rather than trying to help people you would normally help, you tend to feel, you kind of like almost put up this barrier to protect yourself. Rather than reaching out and helping somebody like perhaps you normally would, you tend to kind of, if you do have feelings towards the situation, you kind of tend to ignore them, you tend to internalize them, or just kind of block them out altogether, because in your life, in your mind, you've already experienced so much, and adding more to that plate that you have, you're going to be really maxed out really quickly if you keep adding more on top of it. So instead of reaching out to people, you're going to be more isolated, and you're going to kind of want to avoid those kind of things because you don't want to overload yourself. And that is normal to some degree. But if you kind of picture that on more of a long term, it might be something that started out as a coping mechanism in the short term because, hey, I'm going through a rough time right now. I don't want to add more to my plate than I need, I need to kind of take a break for a bit. Well, when you put that on more of a long-term scale, and suddenly you kind of treat everything that way, you can see how that becomes problematic pretty quickly. Because that could have started out as a defense mechanism to protect yourself from further stress until you can kind of deal with what you already have in front of you. But then over time, you start to look like you're somebody who doesn't care at all. And really, that's not even always true. I mean, there are some people that are like that. Maybe they don't feel as inclined to help people than others. But then there are other people where it's to protect themselves from being overloaded. So, when I was talking to somebody the other day, they were feeling rather stressed out, like, why is it when you try to talk to people about your problems that they seem very emotionally detached sometimes, and, you might tell them about your bad day, and they're like, oh, that's too bad, and then that's kind of it, and maybe you're expecting a little bit more from them than just, yeah, that sucks, and then them going about their day. So then what I explained to them was that, it's not always uncommon for maybe that person could have been going through a rough time too, and even though they seemed very cold, like they didn't want to deal with you, they may have had a lot on their own mind. So then once I kind of, went in depth about that, it was kind of interesting how that person went from, oh my gosh, people seem so cold sometimes when you need something, to like, oh my gosh, that suddenly makes sense. Because when you have a lot going on, of course it's normal to want to talk to people and to feel really kind of sad and like you need some advice. And if you have some good friends, they can be really great about helping you with that kind of thing. But sometimes we tend to forget when we have our own problems going on and you really need somebody to talk to. we kind of forget other people are human and they have their own lives going on too. And that's honestly something I've had to remind myself about as well, because I've had times where I felt the same way, where I was like, oh my gosh, that person really didn't listen to me and I just needed somebody to talk to. And then once I thought about that, I kind of felt bad because I was like, I really hope I didn't burden that person too much. Maybe I caught them at a bad time. Maybe it was just a bad moment and maybe they really did want to listen and they just had a million other things going on at the same time. So yeah, apathy can be one of those things where it can be, you can have somebody who's an apathetic person all the time, or you can have somebody who's situationally apathetic, and it can be a coping mechanism. And because apathy in those situations does protect you from more emotional harm, but it does kind of also take whatever other problems you have and it kind of pushes them away. And let's face it, when you have problems, you have to deal with them at some point. So I don't really feel like apathy is something that has to be all good or all bad. I feel like it's just kind of one of those things that if there is a lot going on and you're already feeling pretty overloaded emotionally, it's okay to come back to those things later. Now, some things they require more immediate attention than others, and that's one thing. But it's okay to prioritize a list of things that you have to do and think to yourself, like, this can really wait. I can do this some other time. How about I do this in a little bit? And, well, this seems like this has more priority over this, so why don't I do this first? So I felt like the key with situations when you find yourself really kind of emotionally blocking things to protect yourself from more stress, if it's like having this little box in your mind where you can kind of take some of that stuff and put it in the box for later, and then like don't forget about the box, but for the time being, put it on a shelf, put it in a box, and don't forget about it. But just remind yourself that it's okay to tackle one thing at a time, and once you have one thing that you've tackled first, then if you want to move on to the next thing, see what's next on the list. But it's very common for things like burnout and apathy to happen also because you have, like, let's say a list of 20 things to do. It's kind of human nature to look at that whole list and think, I have to get that whole list done right now. But you don't always have to get that whole list done right now. Not only because you don't have time to get everything done at the same time, but you want to get everything done well. You don't want to just rush through it. So also reminding yourself that when you have this to-do list of things to do, remind yourself how important it is to take time with all those things, because you don't want to have to go back and do some of those things again because you didn't do it right the first time. Or if it's something involving people and relationships where maybe you didn't spend as much time on it as you could have and now somebody's mad at you. I mean, you don't want to cause issues with that either. It's normal to have days where you feel like you're in over your head, to feel like you're maxed out. I can't possibly take any more. I'm just so maxed out. Acknowledge it. Also do yourself a favor and acknowledge that it's normal to feel that way. And if you've ever had moments where you felt like you were apathetic because you were maxed out, don't beat yourself up about it either, because like I said, it's a very common mechanism. But this is kind of some insight as to why this stuff happens, because it is more common than people think it is. It doesn't make you heartless. It doesn't mean you don't care. It just means you're human, and I mean, you have an instinct to protect yourself, really, from anything harmful to you. But if it's on an emotional level, especially if you're somebody who's been through a lot, you're going to sometimes develop things to protect yourself. Some that are productive and some that aren't as productive, and some that are more productive in the long term and some in the short term. And sometimes over time, it's important to look at some of these traits that you have and not always recognize them as completely good or bad, but maybe just alter them over time to make them a little less maladaptive, or to make them more productive, because there are some tactics that people have to protect themselves that actually do have a purpose, but they have to be more limited. So if you're experiencing a lot of stress in your life, if you really are feeling emotionally detached from things, it's just kind of a sign that you just need a little bit of a break, and it's okay to take some time for yourself, because that's another important thing to think about. You're allowed to take time for yourself. You're allowed to step back and think, I've got a little too much going on. I need a break. That's fine. And you're allowed to give yourself space for that. Because then you'll get back to your routine and you'll be stronger than you were before, and you'll be ready to take on the next day better than you were today. So until next time, have a great day, guys.